Just a final point to share in response to a question, again, from a student with regard to concurrency control. Now, so we've seen how nicely that, we can get it working here for the edit process. So any changes that have been made by another user, right, are nicely shown here. So I can just deal with that. I can override and click save. And if I really want to save it, I can go ahead and do so. But one thing I didn't actually ask you to do, even though I mentioned it, right, during our discussion and in our PowerPoint about concurrency control, is that you can also do it for the delete process. So I had an email come from a student who was very keen. He's following along everything as soon as I get it posted pretty much. And he just had a question with regard to getting it working in delete. He was almost there, but he also had a question that brought up an interesting point I'd like to talk about. So let's just, for example, talk about, if we're going to delete a record, say for this particular Kyler Anthony, right? So I'll open that in a new tab, but somebody in the meantime comes in and makes an edit change, right? Maybe they've changed from Dr. Woodstock Broomspun to Gregory House, right? Okay. Now looking over here, well, I'm still showing the original doctor that was set when I brought up the record to choose to delete. But maybe I was deleting it because that doctor is no longer in the clinic, and so we've decided just to delete the records. But I didn't realize that it's been reassigned to a different doctor. So no, I don't really want to be able to delete this patient because of the change that's been made to the patient's record, right? So I should not be able to do so. So I already have the code in place. So I'll show you the effect, and then we'll go back and we'll look at the code. If I click delete now, it just says the record you attempted to delete was modified by another user. Now, could you show all the things that have changed? Yeah, you probably could, but I would reasonably argue that this is probably good enough. You can always go back and refresh, right? But let me show you one other thing. I should have pointed out before, you can see that the color of the delete button has gone a bit more washed out, sort of grayed out. Well, that should suggest to you right away that it is now disabled, right? And you see that I can no longer click on the delete button anymore. So that's really what we've done. Now I can go back to the patient list, right, for Kyler and Anthony. And if I select delete again, now we see the proper doctor is shown, right? So yes, now I can look and decide, do I really want to delete it? And my delete button is once more available. It even changes to the little pointer as I hover over it to click, and it's no longer washed out as well, right? So I could delete this record. So let's just talk about what we did in the actual code to make this work. Okay, so one of the things here, looking at the delete view, remember, this is something we've already added. When the delete views are originally scaffolded by our system, it does not add one of these validation spans to show a summary, right? So that's something that we added earlier so we could give other feedback from the delete process if there was a model error that was required to mention, right? But where's the actual form? Well, in a delete view, it's kind of funny. It's way down here at the bottom, right? It only contains this little wee bit of code, right? It has the submit button, and there's my back to list we put in there as well in our recent work, right? But here then is where we need to put that row version, right? So we want to persist the row version as it came from the database in the view. So we'll be able to compare it later on when we go back, right? Because who knows, it could be 5, 10 edit changes while we're having it up on the screen, right? So we need the original one that we got with our copy, so to speak, of the data for the actual patient record in this case. So we add the row version here, just like we did for edit. We added it inside the form for edit, right? Since it's on the screen, I'll mention here, that's another little trick we did, is I added a key value pair coming from view data, okay? The key I decided to use was cannot save. I just made that up. I could use whatever I wanted. There's nothing special about that phrase. It's just what popped into my head. That I don't want to be able to save, or I can't save, okay? So I want to be able to disable the button. So let's go back to the controller and see what we've done there. So inside our controller, other thing we had to do in delete confirm, just like we did for edit, is add the parameter, okay, a byte array parameter for our row version coming in, right? So we grab that coming from the view, okay? And then of course we had to go get the patients and so on. Now, the issue the student had, the reason they actually sent me the question was this. They logically, okay, thought that, well, as soon as we go and get the record from the database, just like we did in edit, and let me scroll up and show you that for a second. Up in here in the edit post, right? Remember, we have our row version. We got our patient update from the database, and down here, okay, we added this code to replace the original value of the record that came from the database with the row version that was stored in the view that came with our original version that we saw, right? That's necessary to make sure the logic is correct, that we're actually comparing the right row version value, okay? So the student correctly thought, well, hey, I should, as soon as possible, pretty much, once I get it from the database, do the same thing. And they put that line of code right here. So the email question was, well, it's only a green underline, right? It's just that warning that this could be null, right? When we go and get this entry, we might not actually have a value, okay? So his question was, why do we get the green underline here, but we don't up here in the actual edit post, right? There's no warning about being null here. So what's the difference? Well, Visual Studio is pretty darn smart, right? Think about it. We've got the record from the database. Of course, it might not have been able to find one. There might not have been a match, right? Maybe somebody's deleted in the meantime or for whatever reason. But we already have a null check here, right? We have an if statement checking to make sure our patient update, if it's null, then we return. So we would never go this far in code. So Visual Studio already knows that that has happened, so it knows that we actually do have a patient update. So down here in the post for our delete confirmed, all we need to do is make sure that this line of code itself is protected in the same way if we don't want to see that green warning message. So look at that. In our try block, we have right away, if patient is not equals null, only then do we actually try to remove it. So if we put that same line of code in here, no more warning, right? Because Visual Studio sees we've already done a null check that our patient object is not null, so we're free to just go ahead confidently and change the original value. And that's it, okay? Now, the only thing I'll mention here, of course, something else you had to add, there was no catch block for concurrency exception, right? A DB update concurrency exception. So we had to add this all together. And as I said, I decided rather than try, okay, think about it. There's no, in the delete view, there's no validation spans here for each of the properties, right? So we'd have to do quite a bit of work if you actually wanted to show messages beside each and every one. We'd have to add quite a bit of code in here. And for the infrequent times that this might ever come up, I would argue that it's probably not worth doing all that. I suppose you could, put together in this one message that appears in our validation summary, that's where string.empty ends up, is the summary at the top, right? By the way, I could also just put in that, and that gets me the same effect, right? An empty string. But you could actually, put like a list together listing all the issues that have been changed. I suppose that's possible, but I again would argue that it's really not necessary, in my opinion, that simply giving them this feedback is enough. Go back and refresh, and you can see the latest version of the record. But here's that other little thing we did. Remember our cannot save, our key value pair we added to view data, and the HTML that we're inserting into the page is just our good old disabled equals disabled, right? And that gives us that effect over here, right at the bottom, where that allows us to disable our save button, and away we go. So that's it. That answers the student's question. I thought I'd just share that with everybody. So hopefully you'll find that somewhat useful. If your client really says, no, I want to be able to have concurrency control, make sure we don't delete a record that's been edited while I was looking at it on the screen.